Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ka o te mana hoto a hikina whakatutuki, ko Paul Stocks-aho, kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui. Thank you, it's really great to be here. I was applauding the Minister on the inside, so she could hear me. Look, I know that Minister Woods would have wanted to be here. She's offshore today, so couldn't be, but I'm sure that if she was in the country, she would have been here. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is actually the second time in 2 weeks I've sat in this room. Last week I was here for the Climate Change and Business Conference, and there were 500 business and community leaders in this room. And it really struck me that the conversation around climate change and our responses has shifted quite substantially in the course of the last couple of years even. And the level of commitment from major players around both emissions reductions and adaptation was actually really, really stark. Andrew, thank you for your provocations. I have to say that ministers announce things, not officials, so you'll be a bit left out there. Today, I would just like to take you through some of the changes that have already been foreshadowed in the emissions reduction plans and some of the actions that are underway in MBIE, with, of course, a particular focus on building and construction. So just a reminder of our context, and I'm sure we all know this, New Zealand is a somewhat unusual country in our climate change context, in that for a developed country, over half of our emissions are from agriculture. And I spent 8 years at the Ministry for Primary Industries before I joined MBIE 10 years ago. And I learned there how hard it is to change the basic biology of the rumen, cows and sheep. It's quite challenging stuff to do. And for a primary exporting country, that's a huge challenge for New Zealand in terms of our emissions reductions. And the work that's taking place in He Waka Eke Noa with industry is focused on options that we can do there for changing and transforming that industry. The rest of our emissions are actually no less problematic. So the remaining 50% of our emissions are energy and transport largely. So transport, of course, New Zealand is a long and thin country. Our distribution challenges are not unusual, but that means that we have a real challenge in decarbonising our transport industry, both heavy haulage and small vehicles. And that takes me to energy, which is another one of my portfolios in MBIE. And energy is again a challenge for us because in our electricity system, we're already at 85% renewables. That's really, really, really high by world standards. We do have a goal, an aspirational goal of 100% renewable by 2030, which in itself is challenging. And I was discussing this with the International Energy Agency yesterday as they're doing our draft country report, because not only do we need to build more sustainable renewable energy, but we're doing that as decarbonisation, both in industry and in transport, will create even greater demands on our electricity sector. And I know Ika's here today, and they're playing a really important role in helping both industry and consumers think about what that transition looks like. So really, 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 really challenging context for New Zealand as we head towards zero net emissions by 2050. So what's the way in which we're going to get there? Well, we've already talked about the role of the Climate Commission as providing independent advice both to the government and to New Zealanders about how we might achieve these goals. And the Climate Change Response Act puts out the legislative framework for how we might achieve it. You can't reach a long-run goal without having a series of steps along the way. So the emissions reduction plan that was released this year by the government, it's a comprehensive document. It has like 160 actions or thereabouts, I think. I haven't actually counted them, that cover every area of activity in the economy, whether that's transport, agriculture, energy, waste, building and construction. There's a whole chapter on building and construction. It covers the entire economy and sets a series, the government has set a series of targets for the next 3 emissions budgets, 2022 to 25, 26 to 2030, and 2031 to 2035. And the reason we have these steps is to make it achievable bite-sized chunks of real action. So our emissions reduction plan, if you have a look at the slide, the dotted line shows what would happen for our emissions, assuming nothing changed. We took no actions in the emissions reduction plan. The black bars are what our emissions budgets are planned for the next 3 periods. So you can see that's actually quite ambitious. And the shades of colour is really what we think we might achieve between if we took either very, very ambitious actions or more moderate actions. So whatever you think, we've got a big challenge ahead of us in doing that. So MB is a relatively substantive microeconomic agency. We've got a role in either leading or contributing to a range of these actions. And they include the equitable transition, which is often referred to as a just transition. And that's really thinking about how, as we transform our economy, our industry, our jobs, we make sure that no one gets left behind. We've seen in the past what happens when there's substantive economic transformation. If you're not careful, if you're not planned, if you're not thoughtful, there are communities that actually are left behind. And so it's a core plank of the government's program here, is it thinking about how do we transform industries, how do we transform jobs, how do we take our communities with us. It's a fundamental foundation plank for the work that we do across government. Research, science and innovation, until recently that was one of my portfolios. Anything that we do to transform our economy and our industry will be focused a lot on new technologies, on research, whether it's made in New Zealand or whether we are thinking about how we adapt new technologies and new approaches from overseas. It's a core foundational plank for our transformation. The circular economy, how do we make sure that new industries are truly circular, they are zero net emissions from the ground up rather than retrofitting. Energy and industry, I've already spoken about. This is a really core part. The energy and industry decarbonisation process is going to be exceptionally challenging, but something that's foundational to what we do in New Zealand. And then finally, and importantly, building and construction. The Building for Climate Change program, which was set up in MB in 2020 and which Antonia Reid leads, is, oh thanks Andrew, cheers. I said I didn't need water, as it turned out I did.
That's gin at time.
Never too early. Will be foundational to changing building construction. I'll explain in a moment why that matters so much. So Antonia, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Just why it matters so much. Now, I'm probably telling you, not just with this slide, but a lot of the slides I'm going to talk through, things that you already know. But building emissions really do matter. So if you think back to that slide about New Zealand's profile, of the 50% of emissions that are not agriculture, 15% of total emissions are around building construction. So that's 30% of non-agricultural emissions. When you think about it that way, that's a really big opportunity for the building and construction sector. And there are two aspects to building and construction emissions. Firstly, embodied carbon, and secondly, operational efficiency. So embodied carbon, this is all about what does it take to build a building? Both the construction, the transport, the logistics, the waste, and waste is a really important aspect in climate change. And what can we do as an industry and as a government to reduce the embodied carbon when we design and build buildings from the get-go? Because decisions that we make in the design and construction phase have a lifelong impact on emissions and have a lifelong impact upon the people who occupy those buildings. So when we talk about operational efficiency, which is the other two-thirds, on the one hand we're thinking about how do we reduce emissions, but actually what you're also thinking about is how do you make that building warmer and more pleasant and cheaper to live in for the people who live in these buildings, right? So it's a win-win scenario. So that's the context about why we think that reducing both embodied carbon and operational efficiency in buildings matters both for our climate change ambitions, but actually matters for the people who have to live in those buildings. Again, telling you things you don't need to be told, but you know, that's what officials do. The building construction sector, it's a really large part of our economy, and the last 2 years, and it is so great to be here with people in a room after 2 years of COVID, but the last 2 years have been really challenging, not just for New Zealand, but for the world as a whole and for our economies and our people. Building construction didn't actually have some of the negative downturns that we saw elsewhere in the economy. In fact, it was a boom time for the last 2 years in building construction. Whether that's because people couldn't go overseas and spend their money on other things, or whether there was just latent demand, what we saw was actually record numbers of building consents over the last 2 years, and it's plateauing now, but it was really huge. Building construction is a really large part of our employment story. 10% of the workforce is involved in some way or another in the building construction industry. It's 7% of our economy. $18.1 billion is involved in building construction in some way or other. And as I've said, in the last 2 years, we've had record consent numbers. That's dropping off now, and it's dropping actually quite quickly. And I think that's partly as a result of there's been large amounts of demand, but also we all know that we're seeing challenges in the interest rate environment, which makes affordability a challenge. But nevertheless, there's a substantial backlog of work, and I've personally been waiting for a plumber for some months now, so it's obviously hasn't gone away yet. But we're also seeing some real headwinds. Over the last 2 years, we've seen disruptions from COVID, from the pandemic, and the associated economic aspects of that, and things like fuel crises and the war in Ukraine don't help at all either. So we've been seeing, for example, supply chain disruptions, logistics, labour market issues. In the last year, we've seen a more than 30% increase in the cost of building supplies, and we're expecting that to increase by another 10% before the end of the year. That's 40%. That is far in excess of the CPI, which in itself is at, not quite record highs, but certainly highs for this generation. We've seen shipping delays, we've seen product shortages, although I think Jib is sorted now, but product shortages, and we've got long lead-in times for construction. And we're seeing firms under real pressure. And, we do have a tendency in this industry to have a boom and bust approach. And what we are really hoping for is that we can manage booms but not have the busts, and we have a more stable and sustainable industry taking place. But we also know that this is meaning that firms are less likely to be able to offer fixed price contracts, which in turn reduces certainty for purchasers and consumers. And on top of this, as Minister Woods has said, look, housing supply and affordability remain a real challenge for New Zealand. They remain a huge priority for this government. It's actually, just as an aside, and I'm a public service geek from way back, Minister Woods is the number 3 minister in Cabinet. The number 3 minister in Cabinet has housing, building and construction, and energy. That tells you something really significant about the priorities that this government is placing on these issues. So now I'll get to the meat and potatoes. The energy, the emissions reduction plan, and what we're doing in the building construction area. And the building and construction chapter of the ERP has over 30 actions associated with it. So we're going to be a very busy government and industry going forward. There are 3 areas that we are focusing on as MB and as government around building construction in the ERP, and they are focusing on embodied carbon, focusing on operational efficiency, and focusing on foundational actions that will support the work across. As I've said, the first area that we're focusing on is embodied whole-of-life carbon. That whole-of-life embodied carbon is materials and buildings, the construction process, the whole life cycle. Initial construction, maintenance, renovation, demolition, transport, the waste associated with it. As I've said, buildings and houses are long-lived, and the amount of embodied emissions is affected by original design and construction. So decisions that we take at the beginning of building will have an impact across the life of those buildings, and that it's a very long-lived life, 50 years plus. So a major focus of the Building for Climate Change team is progressing work on proposals in the ERP for thinking about changes to introduce reporting changes for whole-of-life embodied carbons in new buildings. And Tony will be talking about this in more detail. She won't give you a date. The Construction Sector Accord is also an important part of this. So the Construction Sector Accord is an industry transformation plan. It's a partnership between government and industry, supporting a transformation on an industry that in many ways looks not dissimilar from what you might have seen 50 years ago in terms of building. Right? It's not what you'd see, say, in Europe. We do things in a kind of old-fashioned way in New Zealand. So the transformation plan includes a work stream specifically focused on emissions reductions and waste, and that includes thinking about what the skills and knowledge and expertise is required to support new building methods, building transformation. We also want to use market drivers to help shift towards low emissions buildings design and approaches. So Built Ready was announced quite recently. It's a new modular component manufacturing scheme, which will mean that manufacturers, if they comply with certain standards, will get a streamlined consenting pathway. And we know how important a streamlined consenting pathway can be to getting your building done. Modular and off-site building, it can lower building costs, it reduces delays, it produces significantly less construction waste, and it gets things done quicker and more efficiently. The more that we can support that and enhance that, the better it shall be. The other area we're focusing on is in government property and procurement, which is also in my portfolio. So we are using the levers of government, and government plays a really significant part in the economy. We're about 30% of the economy in some form or another. So we're putting requirements in for the carbon neutral government program. So requirements include, for example, NABERS NZ 4 stars for offices over 2,000 square metres and when renewing leases, or 5-star plus for new buildings. And as we all know, everyone needs good neighbours, and that's my only joke. And secondly, we're also looking at procurement guidelines to make sure that when we, as government, procure, we are looking to choose the lowest carbon option for new buildings where that's feasible. So, those levers are important, and they are part of everything that we do as a government when we're procuring. The next area is operational efficiency, and I think this is almost a no-brainer. Making a building cheaper to operate and more emissions friendly is good for everyone. And as with embodied carbon, much of the operational efficiency for a building starts when you do the design and build phase. It is much easier to design a building from scratch, from the ground up, to be operationally efficient, to be low emissions, than it is to retrofit. Retrofit's important. We've got a large housing stock. We will be doing actions across the board to improve, building operations. But design and build at the outset, that's the secret to making a building really efficient. As a first step towards doing that, I have to mention H1 insulation requirements. So from May next year, as you know, new building work and homes must meet the new wall, floor and roof insulation performance requirements. Now, I know we all know that these changes were meant to come into effect in November this year. When we announced them, though, we received a lot of feedback from across the board on a range of different issues, ranging from these insulation standards are great, can you do them quicker, Andrew, through to, well, yes, we really agree with this, but given the headwinds that I've already discussed, and given the state of readiness of the industry on supply chains and labour, we're not quite sure we can meet that time frame. We actually had a lot of feedback on that. We did an unusual thing in that we paused decisions on the rollout of those standards to have a good discussion with industry and understand really what was happening there. On balance, we decided that we would delay introduction by 6 months. That's far less than some people were asking for, but far more than some people hoped for. So we probably got it roughly right if everyone was annoyed with us. The one area we didn't delay was in glazing. We were told by the industry that that was a sector that was ready, willing, able and enthusiastic to adopt the new standards quickly. So we rolled those out from November. It was a challenging discussion. It was a challenging decision. I think, as I say, on balance, we made the right call. One of the things as we are making major transformation in our industry and economy is making sure that we are taking people with us, right? And that's really important. And this was an opportunity for us to have a dialogue with industry about, firstly, what we were trying to achieve, and secondly, some pragmatism around the timing and rollout on that. I expect that we'll have, ongoing discussions about just how much we can achieve and at what pace. Because, Andrew, as you said, time matters. And everything we do, we're already on a significant track to 2050. So everything we do has to be thoughtful and it has to be at pace that we can sustain. There are also some measures that can help efficiency for existing buildings, and the discussion is already taking place on energy performance ratings. When I buy a fridge or a washing machine, I can see how efficient that appliance is. They are somewhat cheaper than houses, and when you think about their overall emissions, the fact that I don't know the emissions performance of my own house, which is a 1920s house, and I suspect it's not that great, even though I've been retrofitting with insulation and glazing, etc. I think that is spread across the entire community. So the more that we can help people understand both what the existing performance of their buildings are and the steps that they can take to improve it, the better we will be. So energy performance ratings are on our agenda, and they're on the agenda in the relatively near term. Finally, what we can do to reduce the emissions of energy supply for buildings. So whether that's the gas transition plan for how do we transition away from the use of gas, how do we, again, ensure that we have sustainable energy and electricity supply. And finally, GIDI, that's a great acronym, the Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry. This is a fund that ECA runs. It started with relatively modest amounts of funding, was it about 30 odd million, I think? 70, so not that modest. And then in this year's budget, the government allocated $650 million towards the government investment in decarbonising industry. And the objective of that fund is to support industry to make changes to their industrial processes, whether that's process heat, whether it's manufacturing processes, to reduce their own emissions. And actually, just as an aside, we're in the throes of the budget process now as government. So the budget's read in May, but we start way earlier as everyone rolls up and tries to convince the Minister of Finance that each government department's or minister's ideas are the best ideas to spend money on. Money talks. And in this year's budget, we've been clearly instructed by the Minister of Finance that the priority for budget spending next year will be on those actions from the emissions reduction plan that are not already funded. So they've said that the ERP sits at the centre point of their budget for 2023, and that's an election year budget. So again, just reinforcing where this sits and in a broad political spectrum where this sits. And again, when we were here last week, parties from all parts of the political spectrum were basically standing up and saying, look, we think this is an important part of New Zealand's future. Finally, the underpinning actions. So it's great to have a series of transactional or really important actions, but you need foundation platforms. And there are a range of things that we are doing to make sure that we get this right going forward. Firstly, really fundamentally is working with Māori, working with iwi to understand their needs and aspirations and make sure that our building and construction sector and our regulatory settings work for them. So that's the first thing that we are focused on. Knowledge, skills, data. What you don't measure, you don't know. If you don't have the skills to undertake change, then you can't do it. So we're focusing on that. We will be working closely with the Green Building Council on some of the data and knowledge and underlying information that we need. I think that's a win-win that we can, both create information and share it. And sharing information is great. There's no point in having stacks of government reports that nobody knows about. So that's a really important initiative that we want to focus on. We're also focusing on our legislative framework, so the law matters. So whether that's in thinking about changes that we might make to regulatory settings, for example, both on reporting and maybe one day on caps for building emissions, one day, but also thinking about things like the building consent system. So we all know and love the building consent system. We've undertaken a bottom-up review of it from building design phase through to the issuing of code compliance certificates. We undertook a consultation on that, 300 submissions. So clearly there are people out there who really care and want to make sure this is as streamlined as possible. I've got to say, I have some sympathy for local government. There's a lot of changes on the horizon. Resource Management Act, Three Waters, consenting. I actually think there's a bow wave of change coming, and making that manageable for local government and communities will be a really important part of the plan. So that's the emissions reduction plan, but it doesn't matter how quickly we act and how much we do. Climate change is happening now, and we are seeing the effects now. So alongside the emissions reduction plan, the first ever National Adaptation Plan was released this year. And this is attempting to identify what's going to happen around our country, around our communities, at a spatial level, and what can we do and what should we do to adjust to that. So that's making sure, for example, that we're building homes and other buildings in the right places. We've all heard, and we've actually been hearing for some time, about the challenges of coastal inundation and what we are seeing with great weather effects there. So starting to plan for that and being thoughtful about where we build our buildings and being thoughtful about the nature of those buildings in a spatial context is a core part of the National Adaptation Plan. And we're funding some work through the Building Levy actually to support our forecasting of what's going to happen at a quite detailed spatial level, I think a 2-kilometre spatial array, to work out in a given community in New Zealand what will be happening over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. I've been a public servant for probably far too long. I think I've ticked over 30 years now. I think I get a plaque or something for that. I've never seen a level of scale, of ambition, of action that I am seeing in the government's emissions reduction plan and the National Adaptation Plan. It can be a little difficult occasionally to get government working together. You've probably all experienced this. Navigating the bureaucracy of Wellington is not straightforward. This plan is being overseen by an interagency executive board of chief executives. Their job is not to think about their own portfolios, but to think about how we are delivering across government for New Zealand. I sit on the Climate Change Deputy Secretaries group across government. We meet every 2 weeks trying to make sure that we are working in tandem and we are actually making real and tangible change. So that's both reassuring and it's scary. And I suppose we should be a little scared. This is a challenging time for New Zealand, and what we do now matters both now and for future generations. And we really only get one shot at this. So the Climate Commission will continue to provide independent advice at times that will be uncomfortable for government, I'm sure. That's the point. They will provide commentary on how well we are doing and what we might need to do differently or faster. And the next emissions reduction plan is in 2025. So, a couple of messages I want to leave you with before I get the questions. Firstly, this sector does matter. It's a really important sector for New Zealand and for New Zealanders, not just for emissions reduction, but for the quality and state of our living, right? Buildings that we live, work and play in across New Zealand, you create. So that's really, really important. Secondly, what we change here in this sector will have emissions impacts for many, many, many years to come. So the changes that we make at the design and build phase matter a lot. Thirdly, we need to take people with us, right? Actually, it's been a really challenging couple of years for all New Zealanders. And there's a lot of stress on Kiwis right now. So as we are making changes that will impact upon industry or impact potentially on the cost of initial design and build, we need to be able to explain, articulate and take people with us on this journey. And this is where you and the Green Building Council in particular play a really important role of building the social dialogue, building the case for change, building the constituency, the appetite, the movement for change. So with that, good luck. We're looking very much forward to working with you. Kia ora koutou. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I enjoyed the injection of humour in your presentation. I felt like I could hear a collective eye roll when you said we all know and love the building consent system. We have loads of questions, but we probably only have time for one or two. So we'll take the top-rated one to begin with. This is from Jerome. Atamarie, might we need to actually cap or ration the number of new buildings in order to really hit our carbon goals? Asking for a friend.
Thanks so much, Jerome. That's a really interesting question. So we are dealing with a series of competing demands and trade-offs here. We know that we still don't have enough warm, dry homes for every New Zealander who needs one. So the concept of capping housing, I think, would be anathema to the government and probably anathema to most Kiwis. So the challenge there is how do we make sure that we actually build housing, oh my God, housing supply, but do it in such a way that manages the emissions, right? So we're not going to not house people. So that takes us back to when we build these houses, and Kaingaroa is a great example of building, really good housing for people who need it, but doing so in a way that's, 5, 6, 7-star compliant. And that's, I think, got to be our challenge going forward. Good.
One more question, because this relates quite nicely to our next presentation. This person says Ireland is a similar size to New Zealand and is planning to retrofit 500,000 homes to drive home health and reduce emissions. Shouldn't New Zealand be looking to improve the state of our existing homes with similar ambition?
Yes. So the Warmer Kiwi Homes program, for example, has been a case in point where we've been doing retrofits, doing subsidies for insulation. And, all around the country there are opportunities there. Actually, in some ways, New Zealand has a slightly different climate from Ireland. If you're in the far north, it's rather temperate. If you're in Dunedin, far less so. So it is a more case of fit for purpose in the right place at the right time. But absolutely, we've already seen the Warmer Kiwi Homes. I know that's an ambition that Minister Woods has is to continue that program and, where possible, to expand it.
Please put your hands together for the Deputy Secretary, Building Resources and Markets at NB, Paul Stocks.